The Lord's Church here in Keller is the singingest group of people you'll find anywhere. I don't know that singingest is actually a word, but I just made it up to describe the zeal and the fervor and the enthusiasm and the joy we have in the Lord for singing His praise. And yet across the religious landscape today, there seems to be such confusion with praise bands and orchestras and organs and choirs and praise teams. And those who are youngest among us may have come into a world in which it seemed like that's the way it's always been. Something like it might appear that we've always had the internet or cell phones. Whatever era we enter into this world, we see what's going on and then we wonder, is that the way it was in the beginning? And in our series, By His Authority, we're considering some of these controversial, some of these hot-button issues that we must address, not only to practice what we preach, but to preach what we practice. And so we find our emphasis on congregational singing, every one of us making melody with the heart as the instrument that God has given us, the fruit of lips, confessing His name and bringing praise to Him. Many people ask, in fact, it's the first thing they notice when they come among us, where's the organ? Where's the praise band? And they may speak of your church as if you or I have our own arrangement. Or they may say, what about this a cappella without instruments? Isn't that just a tradition? Is that something you're used to and comfortable with? And it's so odd you're not willing to change with the times. Haven't churches always used instruments from the very beginning? And doesn't the Bible authorize them to be used in the church? And wouldn't we grow faster if we had concerts? Wouldn't it be easier to invite people? Because music draws. And those that have the best music, we know it can impact hearts and lives. It can affect moods and attitudes. And so it's more important than ever that we try to understand, going back to the very beginning, to Jesus Himself, regarding what He taught and what His followers practiced as a result. Turn with me to John chapter 4. Here, talking with a Samaritan woman at the well about various issues related to everlasting life that would allow her no longer to be thirsty, but to be able to go on and on and on with the Spirit living in her heart. The question turned to her husbands and her background and her past. And then at verse 19, she turned it toward a discussion of the differences between the Jews of her time, of which Jesus was one, and the Samaritans, her own people. There was a disagreement about the place of worship. Verse 20, our Samaritan fathers worshipped in this mountain. You could have seen Mount Gerizim from this city in Sychar and from the watering well where they sat. But in Jerusalem, you people say that's the place where men ought to worship. And certainly they had the temple with all its external trappings and expressions and those things that God had made part of the earlier covenant. And Jesus said something shocking. An hour is coming when neither in this mountain nor in Jerusalem will you worship the Father. Verse 23, an hour is coming and now is when the true worshipers will worship the Father in spirit and in truth. For such people the Father seeks to be His worshipers. God is spirit, and those who worship Him must worship in spirit and in truth. When Jesus addressed the matter of the temple and all the elements that were part of the services there, the Levites, the priests, the special vestments or clothes, the laver for washing hands, the menorah or candle, the altars for incense and burnt offering, the animals that were presented, the tablets of stone, and instruments that were actually required and not optional. If you read in 2 Chronicles chapter 29, He described to this woman a new age in which those physical outward tools, those means that were prescribed long ago, would no longer be in force. And it wouldn't be this specific city or that particular building or the mountain that she pointed to, but in spirit and in truth, God's people could gather on the Lord's Day anywhere and offer to God spiritual, truthful, genuine worship, not restricted to, not expressed by those things given long ago. And then in Jesus' own life, every Sabbath he would attend a synagogue service. Synagogue meaning assembly. These came into being during the time between the Testaments, when the Jews were scattered, and they instituted places in their various towns where they could come together for scripture reading and prayer and singing and a presentation of the Torah, the law of Moses. And Luke 4:16 says this was Jesus' habit. It was his custom. And in that case, he went and he was handed the scroll to read. It was Isaiah, and he talked about the anointed one, the Messiah that was coming. And then he pointed to himself as the fulfillment of those predictions. In all of these cases, Jesus' regular way of worship included none of those temple elements. In the synagogue, there wasn't a separate priesthood. They didn't offer incense or wear distinguished clothes. They didn't use sacrifices or an altar or instruments of music. They sang psalms, but not as had been prescribed for the temple, but instead simply vocal, offering praise to God. You see, all of these elements were part of a system. And one of the challenges, one of the confusions today is that people will choose something like the instrument and will separate that from the rest of the entire layout and the program. And then they began asking, why not? Why shouldn't we? Why can't we? And you and I know that it's very difficult to answer a question, why don't we do X? The burden of proof should be on those that would say, this is something we believe God has authorized that God would have us do. And by the time of Jesus, in the synagogue, that was no longer present. And then we read a few moments ago the Last Supper, and then before arriving at Gethsemane, they sang a hymn. They just sang. In fact, there were several of the Psalms, 113 to 118, that they would sing vocally as they would go for the Passover. And it's that time in which the lamb is going to be sacrificed, including our lamb, Jesus himself. And so they sang. They just sang. When Jesus worshiped the Father, he did not need, he did not use, he did not teach any kind of instrumental accompaniment. And so it wasn't required to enhance their worship, make them feel more spiritual, draw them closer to God. And so wherever you were, you could be walking from the Last Supper to the garden and let's sing a hymn. And so they would sing, offering vocal praise to God. We look at the rest of the New Testament. We've noted before in Acts 16, it's after midnight. Paul and his partner in missions, Silas, are in the prison in Philippi, and they're singing hymns of praise to God. They're scarred, they're beaten, they're hurting. They've been falsely attacked and accused and locked in stocks, but the song is in their heart, and they don't need anything else. In Romans 15, verses 9 and 11, sing hymns and sing praises. In Corinth, we see in 1 Corinthians 14 the importance of singing with the Spirit and with the mind or understanding. We see in Ephesians 5, as we read, that those who are filled with the Spirit, there are several participles there that explain how we express that fullness of the Spirit. And one of them has to do with teaching and admonishing one another in psalms and hymns and spiritual songs, giving thanks to God the Father and being in submission to one another out of reverence for Jesus Christ. In writing to these Gentiles, where instruments were very common in pagan worship, in the various temple structures in Ephesus and Corinth and Colossae, it's very clear, it's very direct, it's stated unmistakably that the organ God has given us with which we are to make music is the human heart. And therefore, there's a content, there's instruction, there's admonition, there's warning, there's exhortation. Even though worship is directed vertically toward God, there's also a horizontal element in which we are strengthening one another, reinforcing all those around us to know the truth of God and live by it. Colossians is something of a sister letter to Ephesians, written also to Christians that were not Jews, and the same instruction is given there. In James, is anyone cheerful? Let him sing songs of praise. Hebrews 13:15 notes that the sacrifices we offer today, they're not blood, goats and lambs and bulls. All that was fulfilled by Christ. But we still bring a sacrifice. It's the fruit of our lips, the melody in the heart, the fruit in the lips. In fact, Colossians and Hebrews both indicate that what was done before, it was a shadow, it was a facsimile, it was something that resembled the real thing, but it wasn't. The substance belongs to Jesus Christ. And so the New Testament is deafening in what it does not say about instruments, because they were so prevalent in the temple worship of old, and because they were so commonly accepted by these who were coming to Jesus from pagan, heathen, Greek-type, idolatrous backgrounds. And when we look through the New Testament, it's fascinating for what it says and what it doesn't say. Sing, make melody in the heart, shout for joy to the Lord, teach and admonish and encourage one another. And those who came into the church of Christ from pagan backgrounds left behind all those external trappings. Let's talk about a principle of understanding the Word of God. We've already seen it. It's the idea that when God specifies what He wants, He excludes substitutions, additions, or subtractions. He does not allow us or permit us to make changes if He has been particular about what He expects of us. We've already seen this. He told Noah to build an ark, and He gave him the specifications and the material and the layout, the blueprint for it. It was non-negotiable. It was not Noah's place to say, well, what if we were to add this? I think it'd be more comfortable. I think it'd be easy, more relevant. I think the animals would like it better. None of that. The sacrifices we're reading in Leviticus and Numbers and Deuteronomy, very detailed, very exact. We saw what happened to Nadab and Abihu in Leviticus 10 when they offered to God strange or unauthorized fire. They lost their lives. Aaron was to be the high priest, and it wasn't up for a vote or a majority decision. The Levites, that's the tribe that will care for various matters. And the temple, we saw this morning in Deuteronomy 12 that God would choose a central place for His people to come. We understand with the Lord's Supper, we're not to add to or take away from according to our preferences or our wishes. There are two elements. God is specified, God's also excluded. We don't pray to the Virgin Mary. We don't pray to the so-called saints. We don't pray to any human being. Jesus Christ is the one mediator between God and man. So the Bible doesn't say, don't use this person as a mediator, don't, because God has made it clear. We practice immersion. The Bible never says, do not sprinkle. But we understand because God has told us how we are to baptize, that is what pleases God, and that's all we're authorized to do. We don't have a pope or a papa. There's nothing in the Bible that says particularly don't have a pope. We're told that elders, overseers, shepherds lead the local church the first day of the week. The Bible doesn't say not Monday or not Tuesday. In each of these cases, we recognize, and so do those around us as a rule, that in certain areas at least, when God has indicated this, He excludes all else by His silence and doesn't have to rule them out with a statement regarding what is not to be done. Giving, preaching, praying, vocal music, these are all things that God has told the church to do. Well, wouldn't the church be better off? Wouldn't the services be more inviting? Wouldn't a lot more people want to come if we had X, Y, and Z? Shouldn't all of our talents, all of our skills, all of our interests be a part of the worship of the church? And the religious world, by and large, would at least say with some things, no, you can't bring that in. and they would go back to the Bible. We're simply trying to apply that principle to the matter of our worship in song. For the sake of time, I will not post all of these, but simply to note with you, and it will be in the blog, that so many who have gone before have made this point. Clement in 150 to 210 AD, the one instrument of peace, the word alone by which we honor God is what we employ. Listen, we no longer employ the ancient psaltery and trumpet and timbrel and flute. Origen in 325, for the unison song of the people of Christ is more pleasing to God than any musical instrument. In all the churches of God, with one mind and heart, with unity and agreement in faith and worship, we offer to God a unison melody in our singing of psalms. Chrysostom, somewhat later, spoke of not using the lyre or stretched strings or plectrum or musical skill or any instruments. And he said, just as God allowed animal sacrifices, so he let the Israelites of old have these instruments, condescending to help their weakness. Augustine said, harps are to be excluded from this place. Jerome said, a Christian should not know what a lyre or flute is, nor what their use is. So once we leave the New Testament, we find deliberately and purposely and intentionally the absence of these instruments and a recognition that the worship that followers of Jesus bring to God is spiritual, it is sincere, and it is simple, and it is with the voice as God directed. If you were to look up church music online, you would find in various sources the very same point being made, that all of the early church's music was vocal, not only by a Kurt Sachs of Columbia University, but by a Presbyterian scholar or someone from the Church of England, as it's called, that there is unanimous agreement. So there's no question from the New Testament, nor is there any question from history, that singing was authorized, was employed, and was used from the very beginning. Kurt Sachs said all ancient Christian music was vocal. Lyman Coleman, the Jews in their temple service, the Greeks in their idol worship, they were accustomed to singing with the accompaniment of instrumental music. The converts to Christianity must have been familiar with this model, but it's generally admitted that the primitive Christians employed no instrumental music in their religious worship. Hugo Lechtentritt said, only singing and no playing of instruments was permitted in early Christian church. Now let me ask you, was that because of their preference? Or was it due to the fact that those in the first century didn't like instruments? They didn't enjoy them. They wouldn't find them appealing. Or was it because instruments would not have drawn more people from the community? It was none of those things. It was because Jesus Christ, by his authority, taught his followers to sing. It was because Jesus sang. And it was because in the early church, there was no longer the set of trappings and external symbols and outward expressions that were part of the old system. This phrase, a cappella, today is used to mean without instrumental accompaniment. But actually, a cappella, the word capella is from chapel, and a cappella means in the way of the chapel, in the way of the church. This phrase could never have come about if the way of the church were not singing, offering simply the voice to God. What about organs? When did they come into worship? Well, in about 670 in some churches, not as part of singing, but as a prelude. And then in the 1300s, they were in widespread use. Well, it's fascinating next to see that when those who had come from that background sought to reform, they tried to protest, they tried to go back to a more authentic biblical worship, they all came to the very same conviction. Every one of them spoke clearly and bluntly. Martin Luther, John Knox, John Wesley, Charles Spurgeon, Adam Clarke. Calvin's quotation is simply one that illustrates the many. These would be no more suitable than the burning of incense, the lighting of lamps, and the restoration of the other shadows of the law. Calvin understood that that system, that administration, that way had been done away, and that Jesus Christ had brought a new way of worship from the heart, not needing and not authorized to use those external things. You notice as you study church history that it repeats itself. And here you see, starting with the first century and then over time, instruments were added. These Protestants came about and they said, that's not right. Let's go back just to singing. And then, just 300 years ago, many of these Protestant groups began adding instruments. Restorationists, as we seek to go back to the pattern and the plan of the New Testament, we've taken the same step that had been taken in the past. This is not new with us. This is not our tradition. It's not our idea or our invention, and it's not our preference necessarily. We're trying to be what they were, teach what they taught, and do what they did. Well, even in the Restoration plea, there came about by the year 1906 a big division between those who were willing to split the church by adding instruments and those that refused because they were not authorized in the New Testament. And in 1906, those that brought in the instrument in churches of Christ took 85% of the church buildings, 85% of the schools that were in existence at this time. And there was such a discussion, such an emphasis on Bible things and Bible ways by those that insisted on a cappella singing that it seemed like the issue was settled and we would not face it again. But today, here we are. And people still wonder, hasn't it always been this way with the organ or the praise band or team or the orchestra? And we go back once again to notice the Bible hasn't changed. The discussion of it hasn't changed. Nothing new has been brought out in the last 100+ years on this subject. There are practical issues that we want to address as well. Someone says, I don't know about instruments. Shouldn't they just be a matter of preference or choice? Someone will say, this isn't a salvation issue, and they imply by that it's not as crucial, it's not as significant. Or they'll say something like, well, Jesus didn't die for this or that. You're making too much out of it. And I ask this question. Is singing to God an obedience issue? Whatever people say about salvation issue and whatever list they might make, just set that aside. Is it a matter of obedience to worship God as He is taught? And then I ask this, is it a sin to divide the church with something that many consider optional, that's part of what they would like to have or what to do, and next you have this group going this way, and this group going that way? Is that pleasing to God? Is that His will? And then you see in the instrumental groups, there's further division because they'll have a traditional instrumental service and a contemporary instrumental service, and then multiple services where the type of music this group chooses is the type they will have. Does that reflect the unity of the one body, the one hope, the one faith, the one baptism of the New Testament? In these cases, biblical authority loses to human preference. And if you ask a person to show you in the New Testament where it teaches the church to worship with instruments, it cannot be found. And eventually the response will be given, I prefer, I like, I want, I enjoy. And suddenly preference becomes a key factor in the church coming together. I've met people from time to time that have come to visit with us and they said, we like organs, we have no objection to them, but we don't like drums. And where they were, they started adding rock music and harder, stronger, upbeat music. Well, one leads to the other and another and another. And every time the question is the same. Why not? Why shouldn't we? Wouldn't it help the church grow? You know, the young people really like, or we've found in our community that this kind of music is going to draw people. So then congregational voices are weakened and often silenced because the prominence of the orchestra or the band. And people may be encouraged to sing, but many may sit and listen rather than participate. And there's that ever-increasing threat toward performance and entertainment rather than simply acknowledging the glory of God. And people, rather than the Lord, can become the audience. We're going to have those that are the best at presenting music. Crowds are going to come, and they're going to listen. You and I say that's backwards. Worship is beneficial to us, but it's for God. He's the audience. He's the one listening. He's the one watching. What has God told us to do? And there's one more practical issue, and that is the fact that all those of every persuasion agree that singing alone, singing without anything else, is acceptable to God. Well, if there's agreement there, why not stay with what we know is right and what we know is true and with what we know pleases God? We've said the times they were changing. Let's say they're changing again because we're talking about this cycle where we just seem to get past it and then it comes back again. And we think we talked about it and then it comes back again. And I preach on this subject at least once a year. I have it on my calendar and on my plan, even though I'm doing it now as part of this by His authority, because it is so important that we preach what we practice. And we emphasize that the Bible has not changed. And what pleases God has not changed. And what God has authorized has not changed. And we've tried again and again to take all of it back to Jesus. Because Jesus is the one who sang, as we've noted. He's the one who taught the removal of the old system and the beginning of the new. He's the one who empowered and delegated to the apostles the right to send letters about singing and making melody with the heart and teaching and admonishing one another in psalms and hymns and spiritual songs. And so in this day and time, our worship to God is refreshingly simple, beautifully heartfelt and sincere and spiritually based. And it doesn't depend on how well we sing or know this or that particular song, but it is a heart that beats for God, expressed through lips that bring praise to God and that lead to a life lived with and for God. So we never want to separate our daily life from the commitment we make to God when we sing. It sets the tone. It begins the days that are ahead by reminding us His majesty, His glory, and our submission to Him. The Lord's invitation we offer because we recognize that that's very simple as well. It's not complicated, but one who genuinely repents of sin and recognizes that Jesus died to remove the burden of sin, then confesses that faith in Jesus before a company such as this, and then enters into His death and His burial and resurrection in baptism. And then the Bible says He lifts us up from the miry clay, He sets us on a rock, and He puts a new song in our mouth. Are you singing that new song today? Is there a response you need to make to the gospel of Jesus Christ as we stand and sing?